In this first third of the Brahms's first Ballade, Opus 10, so much is the untold, the hinted. The fifths are everywhere, open, non-major, non-minor, distant, genderless, neutral, avoiding the emotional impact of the minor third or of the major third in the triads of the tonic and the dominant in this case, or the B flat major, where each melody, each note of the melody is harmonized. It's heartwarming, emotional, because you read the score, which is all we have from him. And it is in 4/4. But does it sound in 4/4 in terms of raising direction? For instance, the middle section of this first third is by 5 chords. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then rebreathing or changing bow direction. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. If you count the 4/4, or if you count the 5 for each group of 5, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He could have changed the meter according to the downbeats of the group of notes in each phrase, by 4, by 5, by 6, or some uneven. But it's fantastic to see how freer he is in his overlapping bar lines, phrases which you're not supposed to hear in the performance, but in some kind of hinted suggestion that the direction of the line floats always ahead, but you don't know where is the downbeat, and you don't really want to know. Until you stop on the dominant. Whenever in the beginning is for the upbeat clear, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. The upbeat, downbeat demands to stop on a down or a third beat out of 4 in order to restart at 4. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4 and 1, 2, 3. Sorry for singing. Whenever here it's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, here is clearly by 5, and here is by 4 with the upbeat. So if you count the upbeat in the opening as 1, then you do have your 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. Does it matter? Because the bar lines are there for a purpose, to organize the rehearsals with great group of musicians, so we know where we pick up when we stop. But when you're alone, the bar lines are not significant for the phrasing direction or design of the steps towards it. And therefore, they're rigid indication when they're unchanging meter compared to the changing pulse meter of the phrasing, which gives that sense of freedom. So that is one thing, to already count the group of notes that lead to an arrival point. I'll give you an example. This is the upbeat. and I would like to arrive to the dominant, and then restart on the tonic, and then arrive on the subdominant, and then on the dominant. Does it mean that if I want to practice that direction of line flowing for the legato, I could practice it instead of the andante indicated without metronomic marking, walking or pacing, with allegro? You know exactly where it leads, every time, all the time. But when you stretch each of the syllables of the word, or you almost spell it, I-L-O-V-Y-O-U. Every time you stretch the beat, you start spelling and not sentencing or phrasing with words towards sentences which would reach paragraphs or stanzas if it's poetry. It seems to me like his music is so free in its expression, because if there were words or lyrics, I would like to tell you from where I come, so far away, distant and mysterious, and why not come close to and here and there. Silly words. Of course, you can make up any other words you want, but then by putting lyrics into the melodic line, repeated or melodic consecutive tones or leaps with intervals, repeated, anticipation, passing tone, the leap of the fifth, and then only neighboring tones. You observe these intervals more because when you play there are no lyrics. Therefore, your attention is not diverted to the meaning, rather to the aesthetic of the choices of the, for instance, if he had done alternatively, instead of the choice of the upbeat repeated note anticipation, A, A, F, G, A, he could have done, or what I'm trying to suggest is that his repeated note is melodic. It's a repeated change of syllable of a word, for instance, or two short words of a syllable each. So in a way, the inevitable and obvious fact is that the lyrics are explicit by the purpose that they vehicle a meaning, regardless if it's also around or to the point of the story, but the music itself, suggestive by the harmonic progression, the melodic leaps, the pulse and the phrasing, the disposition on the piano, for instance, in this case, as we can see, so much octaves spreading, so many fifths and very few thirds. All this contributes to a mood, an atmosphere, something mysterious or something sad or something defeated or something distant or something thoughtful within side and not expressed outside of one's expression. It's more like as if you enter in somebody's inner world thoughts. You wonder, is this action or is it contemplation? Is it perhaps within the two? Or is it action that is so far away that it seems like part of the background horizon line? In other words, it's almost static. By choosing, as he does, the anticipation repeated note, and then very few moving notes, but step motion with passing tones, and then a very few leaps in the melody, of fifths, which is really, again, harmonic, using the perfect interval and not the major or minor emotional interval of the third for the mode minor, major, major, minor, or major, minor, obviously. So when the pianist has to choose interpretation for the direction of the line, for the purpose of the storytelling, for the atmosphere that comes through in the reading of one's own reading, and then how you translate it through your emotional and intellectual understanding, or at least perhaps full circle, forget the analytical and just connect to the original emotional connection, to dispense the piece as it comes to you from what you perceive the composer's intent through the composer's and publisher's notation. And there you get to the discrepancies that wonder, why is there a grace note and not a dot at age 16? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Does it mean that he wanted the grace note? Well, by essence, if he wrote it unmeasured, is that he should accept that, or he suggests that the performer chooses according to their psyche, to their taste, to their stylistic understanding. Of course, in today, we need to compartmentalize the stylistic understandings in plural from centuries of music, different styles, when in their music time, the Beethovens, the Brahmses, the Haydns, and the Mozarts, and the Bachs, meaning all the musicians in their time period, they all bathed in their time period with the music of their present, very little of their own past. That was little accessed, or little studied, also short living time. Everything has to be in the fierce intensity of the present, and emergency to produce. And I find that when we have to find how to define the soundscape, we have to go through the understanding of the notation, and therefore does the intent suggest by the purpose or not using of a rhythmic pattern, by the grace note with a slash on top of it, which should be tight. Is it a glissando? The deep action of the modern piano, allowing more rounded sound, and fortepianos of his time also make it more articulated, ta-ta. But perhaps he wanted it to be more like just held through the anticipation of the downbeat of the A, and insert that grace note. Let not the grace note distract from the repeated A's. And if you do, then it becomes an emotional statement of the grace note becoming really the neighboring tone. But in that case, you should have been perhaps notated dot at age 16 and not quarter with grace note. Compared to? It's an open-ended question which cannot be solved by the individual taste of each performer. And I think my role as a teacher is to offer the options and guide with decisive gentleness, let's put it this way, so that I can see how the psyche of the performer is shaping through the reading of the score, in this case the articulations, too slow with dots or non-legato, whenever this is by slurs on two. So that's legato, this is non-legato, and this is non-legato. And then in the second half of the, or middle section of the opening page, it's a single beam of 5 notes. And he says poco più moto, a little more flowing forward in motion, and then return to the tempo primo of the andante, which is not an adagio. And if that was the case, then how much did he want really that the tectonic plates differ? Is it really flustered, or is it just a little flustered? I think it's up to us to define these subtle merging in traffic, changing lanes, or changing as when we drive into another perhaps more crowded traffic, because the texture matters. Here it's very busy, have a quarter note and harmony on each melody, the melodic note. Whenever here you had a whole bar of a single harmony, 4 beats, and then it's 1 on each beat. So this harmonic tempo change is also indicative of poco più moto, a little forward. So if you take that in account, you can argue if he goes by 5 notes instead of 4, if he uses harmonies on each quarter note versus 1 on each half or whole note rather in the last bars before, how much do I on top of it add tempo change above the pace itself? Or do I just let the busyness of the structure of his harmonic tempo make that difference? Perhaps it's a good thing to share. The piece does it, and you just give it a little intent, but you don't want to overstate it with your personal drive. Why shouldn't you? Devil's advocate, as I'm speaking loud voice about choices, is because it's all about structure of the whole page. It's not just this section, that section. It's how you define the pace and then comes the most, unfortunately, or the least indicative, is the fermata on the 3rd beat before the return of the original theme. Normally we have to restart on the upbeat, which was a 4th beat in the 4/4, but he ends on a 3rd beat. Then he adds a fermata, which means that, is it 2 beats? Then we start on the 5th beat. Do we do 3 beats? We start on the 6th beat. Do we do 4 beats? Do we start on the 7th beat? If it was to extend and calculate the amount of beats in that bar, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And is it necessary to define exactly the amount of beats of the structure of the fermata, since he chose to be unmeasured by the sign and not organize it rhythmically as he could, should, or perhaps intended to do, or chose that let the performer choose how long to stop on it? I made the 6/4 bar. And if not, I could make, with 2 extra beats, 2 bars of 4/4. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, which will make the fermata longer than if it was 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. I think the important thing is to define and then go back to it and play it, hear it innerly as well as outerly, and see which one you feel sits best in the mood. which one is hectic or less, contemplative or less. And there are elements that are indicative. Everything in the left hand rises, the deep octaves because of the straight strung fortepianos of that time, basses which were in fact lacking depth or octaved. The three voice triads, mostly 6/4 and 6th position, in the right hand are going down and the bass is rising. And then he reproduces it into C minor after he did it in G minor, and then when he stops on the dominant of the return to the D minor of the dominant A major, the two parts again drop for the top and rise from the bottom. But the middle voice rises, da, da, di, re, do, mi. As if not to diminish the inner voice, even if he says sostenuto, which for him indication means ritenuto, and there is a hairpin to the subdominant, and then diminuendo release on the dominant, and then piano on the upbeat of the start. And I still think that if we can follow this pattern, then the last reproduction should have in the middle voice the crescendo at the moment of the release of the hairpin, or and if you put the pedal on the second and third beat together, then you have the full triad. But he didn't tie it. He didn't indicate the pedal either. So is it a hint? Or to be avoided melodically and finish on the open fifth triad rather than therefore non-triad without the third, the leading tone, in this case the major triad? Did he intend it to be in the resonance, in the acoustics of the residue? Did he not want it to be heavy? I can question his intent or his avoidances or what he wants the performer to avoid when reading it by intuition or misguessing, as I like to call it, more than wrong reading. I think it's fascinating to enter in a dialogue with, what did you want? How did you want it? Did you really want it this way? And what's the purpose of this middle voice in the third reproduction of the sequence to be different? He didn't do that. It is forever moving to enter in dialogue in the present time with a music written long time ago and try to decipher through in between the lines, in the suggestions, the phrasing, the group of notes, the pulse, the rhythm, the harmonic progression, the harmonic rhythm, the modulations, the dispositions, like these 3 octaves and this ostinato, tonics and dominant, and then define from there what it is. So my best suggestion is to imagine it, what it could have been, in order to play it more meaningfully what it is. Or I know it's silly, or perhaps in other words, is there one to accompany, one to melodize, and another one, or the left one, to harmonize? And then you return to what he wrote. You start playing with a voicing or the three, or none. The orchestration in a symphony, for instance, by Brahms in this case also, would be very clearly indicative of the shaping, the sculpting, the three-dimensionality of the material in its colorized by orchestra instrumental timbres, by groups or individual or combined instruments. What has to prevail? The ostinato, the melodic note, the grace note, melodized or not. All these things which here, in fact, remain to be chosen by us, by ourselves, with our own consciousness, our own desire, our own response, desire of authenticity, and our response to what the music means to us. Wrongly or rightly, it means something to us that we mean in turn. And we can change mind, but it is a very delicate moment of choice making. This is just a sample few of the thoughts that can come to mind when you try to decipher the score, literally decipher, as if it's an enigma machine that has coded meanings. Not necessarily other than by making, therefore, ultimately for the student or even for the teacher, the student admittedly's first encounter with the piece, and the teacher's later newer re-encounter with the piece. The piece reveals itself through life in different ways. It's never a done deal. And probably it keeps us wondering because it speaks to our imagination, and we have to make a temporary choice of how we're going to state all these elements together. And I find that ultimately, after the analytical observation of the score, we should go back to what is our intuition and perhaps keep something from what the reflection brought us to foresee how to move ourselves through this section. Imaginary lyrics. Be your own conductor for the phrasing direction with the beats and the group of notes. Be the orchestrator through the voicing and the highlighting of elements according to what it means to you, and not necessarily to your teacher or to all the other recordings that you can trace today. Because in fact, here it's few reflections about the hidden part of the iceberg, because inevitably the visible part or audible part of the iceberg is the top triangle, and that's what people play without to talk. And teachers talk without to play, and students get puzzled from the way they loved it or found pleasure in playing it, and perhaps overwhelmed by the details of the elements that they are realizing exist, more or less defined by the composer in the notation for the intent. Then it's up to the student to make that full circle assessment and say, okay, that I don't, this I might, but generally I wish this. So it's a healthy rejection of things that you're taught, not necessarily by attitude. It's not about being obedient or disobedient in a teacher-student transmission, which inevitably that lineage is on the moment of the transmission, extremely asymmetrical. But in fact, through the life of the teacher, there is some symmetry with the student, because in fact we remain all at all ages students of the piece. Even those who transmit it with the knowledge, the experience and the answers, or the capacity to phrase and formulate the questions which we'll read and therefore which will play through the performance, which will be then a statement for the audience, knowledgeable of the piece or not, but the audience will feel that there is a, if not a conviction, there is a commitment, there is a direction. We call it inspiration, we call it visionary, we can call it almost appropriation, as if you recompose it with his notes and his rhythms and his acoustical combinations that are hinted. But then the acoustics of today, the instruments of today, enhance things more, overburden the basses which were weaker in his time, and now we have to rebalance it rather. Instead of, because he doesn't dub the octaves in the right hand, only in the bass, because he wasn't deep enough for him on his piano. And today's piano's basses are deeper than the top. And we cannot change that in terms of the note structure and say, oh, I'll just play the lower bass note. It'll be today's piano enough to have the balance of the two hands. Since we have to play all the notes, I think we should voice in order to give the depth without the loudness and combine with the chords. So in a way, in that case, we restore a certain balance that he was compensating for a certain weakness that the orchestral hearing of his composing didn't fulfill through the piano that he had to play on. In other words, composers are never limited, or most never limited, by what they not even feel is limiting. They just imagine, hear inner truths, and they just uncompromisingly write them. And it's up to us, performers and of course teachers, to find ways to translate that intent. And hopefully I wouldn't meet him or his spirit if I do, and be told by him, es ist nicht so. It wasn't this way. I say, Johannes, sorry. Perhaps wrongly, but I loved it.